Good evening, everyone. Noswaith. We'll just give a couple more minutes, see if other people want to join, and then we'll make a start. All right. We've got lots to cover this evening, so let's get into it. So welcome to the Heroes version of Litcast Live. We did an Inspector Calls a few weeks ago, so that recording is still up and is worth looking at if you want to revise any themes or any dramatic devices for an Inspector Calls, just because obviously you can pause it as we go through and you can see some of the notes that we've got there. So I'm going to do a very similar thing now for Heroes. So there is lots of information, and it is kind of recommended that you come back to this perhaps if there's areas that you need to go back over, and obviously then the notes will still be there too. Okay. So we're going to go through the exam structure very briefly, some common questions or common errors that people tend to make in this part of the exam. Very, very briefly talk through extracts and essays, but the bulk of this evening is about themes and dramatic devices. So the reason why we're looking at themes is because it's likely that you will have done work on the major characters, and actually by looking at the themes, you end up talking lots about the major characters anyway. So it's a nice way to explore the characters and some of the minor characters through those kind of different lenses. And then we're going to have a look at dramatic devices. It says dramatic devices, but that extends to narrative and language as well, which leads us kind of on to the structure. So you can see the bit in red that I've got is kind of the difference between Of Mice and Men, Inspector Calls and Heroes. So for the essay in Heroes, we are assessed equally on AO1 and AO2, whereas for an Inspector Calls it's 67% AO4 context. So because of that, the focus of your essay is a little different. It's much more about analysing the language in front of you, language choices, but then you can also extend that to structural choices and narrative choices as well. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about after talking about some of the themes, just so, you know, if you're thinking, oh, well, you know, that would be a big part of my essay, writing about context, so what can I put instead? Hopefully these are some of the things that you could think about or explore, because actually it feels like quite a scary thing to not have that context to almost fall back on, but actually the book really lends itself to talking about narrative and language in the same way that Inspector Calls really lends itself to talking about that context. So the texts are almost designed to help make these particular assessment objectives easier to hit. So that's our extract and our essay format. And I'm saying this because I know there are people from a couple of different schools on tonight, but if you are from my school, then you know that you would have likely taken part in your sort of walking, talking mock today to have a bit of an idea of some of the timings. And that was really the whole point of that exercise, just for you to get a feel for the exam and the timings. So you'll know now that this is the second half of the exam and kind of what that second hour feels like now, the 20 minutes and the 40 minutes. All right. So as we go through, you're more than welcome to use the chat as you have in other live sessions, but Our usual disclaimers apply. So there are people from several schools here. Please do not put any identifying information about your name, address, school, or anything like that into the chat. And nothing about your teacher either. Just because, like I said, there are other schools here, and we don't want that identifying information out in public domain. And in the same vein, be nice. So try not to use any profanity or get stroppy in the chat too much. Okay, but you are more than welcome to use the chat as we go through to ask questions, and that's kind of formed the basis of lots of our conversations in previous sessions like this. So I'll be checking it regularly, so please feel free to use it. All right, let's jump in to our first tips for the extract question. Hello people in the chat. Just making sure that there are people there and that we're alive. The last session I did, incidentally, was for year 11, and it was a writing session, and I had one person turn up for 10 minutes. So it's very nice to know that there are people here and it's somewhat engaged, which is good. So tips for the extract question. We know extracts really well, and this has not changed. This does not change between Inspector Calls, Of Mice and Men, or Heroes. It's the same gig. So you start by explaining what's happening in the extract. And when I say explain, I'm talking really short. We place it with a sentence, right? You've probably been told that already, but we place the extract in our opening sentence. And that's not about us knowing what chapter it comes from, or if it's Inspector Calls, what act it comes from, anything like that. We're talking about the story, like where in the story does this occur. So if it's the first time that Francis meets Nicole, just put that in a sentence. If it's if you're not even quite sure exactly where it takes place, but you know it's roughly in the middle or roughly towards the end, again, place it in that sense, right? This takes place towards the end of the story. And it's the whole point of it is it's about, that sentence is about framing your response so you know what moment you're talking about. But it's also kind of getting rid of that the blank paper fear, where you're kind of worried to start writing. So it gives you something kind of concrete to be able to put down. So that's kind of how we would start our extract responses. Then we want to be using quotations. We kind of say that we're looking at maybe 5 words or less for quotations, nice and short. Okay. And this again applies for the essay as well. So now, obviously, you might have a really good quotation you really want to use that's 7 words. That's fine. If you're able to, make that work for you, if you know that all of those 7 words of whatever the quotation is are important and key to making your argument, absolutely fine, go for it. Okay. The reason why I say often think about 5 words or less is, number one, that it's easier to remember quotations that are 5 words or less. Short and sharp is good. But also from an examiner's point of view, when you look at quotations embedded into work, if the quotations are shorter, that tells the examiner that you're more confident to really hone in on a specific word or a specific phrase and talk about the impact of that. And no, lovely. Well, let you go. Let you go. No, you gotta go. Okay. So having those short quotations is really important because it shows that confidence, it shows that precision. All right. And what we really want at kind of the highest level, we want what we call kind of evidence stacking, which is where you use several short quotations rather than kind of a long quotation where it feels like you're hedging your bets. You're looking for a short quotation and several short quotations where it shows how precise you can be with your evidence to build your argument and build your case. Okay. Now here it says about alternative interpretations. So again, we're not necessarily looking for you to do a whole paragraph on this could mean this or it could mean this. What we want here is tentative language, right? So it could, it might. that kind of language that demonstrates that you understand that someone else could read this in a slightly different way. That's all. Okay. So that it's a really easy thing to put in, but it's just a really useful kind of tone to set in your response. And sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it's not essential, or it's not relevant. But where you think there could be more than one interpretation of a quotation, then using could or might is a good thing to do. We do want to try and discuss the whole extract, the beginning, the middle, and the end. Okay, so when we think about extracts, and again this applies for all texts, there's a reason why the examiner started that extract where they did and finished that extract where they did. So, the papers are put together consciously. It's not just kind of a random extract generator that pulls together the extracts for an exam. So there's going to be a reason why it starts and finishes where it does, and that means there's probably something good to talk about in the opening couple of lines and in the closing couple of lines. So just consider that when you're looking through and analysing. So something from the beginning, something from the end, and then we're looking for about 5 other quotations throughout. Okay, and quotations can be single words. So if you were taking single words, you might even pick out more than about 7 quotations. And again, remember that kind of idea of evidence stacking. So picking out short, sharp bits of evidence and kind of building a picture of something. And that is a really useful thing to do in the essay as well. Obviously focus on the question throughout. If it's a mood and atmosphere question, think about your emotions. All right, what emotion is created here? And also think about tension. So emotion and tension are usually good ways to think about mood and atmosphere. In an Inspector Calls and in certain parts of Heroes, tension is a really palpable, you can really kind of feel it in particular extracts. And therefore it's quite easy to sort of talk about. But again, any kind of emotions that you can kind of find, and also thinking about changes. So often extracts that focus on mood and atmosphere have a change or a shift in emotion partway through. So thinking about that can be really useful as well. And then finally, don't waffle, okay? Marks are awarded for the clarity of your response. And the waffling is important. You don't want to be spending 3/4 of a page talking about one quotation. You might analyse it really closely and in lots of detail, and that might be great. But at the end of the day, you are marked on the coverage of the extract as well as kind of that depth of analysis. So it's about striking that balance. So we want to pick out that quotation, say something really perceptive about it, move on. Okay. And yes, you are assessed on your close reading. So that's what I mean about being really precise when you're picking out your evidence. And if you've got a longer quotation, you need to be picking out some words from that and talking about them. Okay. Then we've got our essay question. Okay. And we want to be thinking about those logical paragraphs. We want to be thinking about building an argument. And when we talk about contextualize here, we're not talking about context. We're talking about the idea of taking a theme and or a character and placing it within the structure of the story. So, if you think about the character of Larry LaSalle, what does he add to the story? What does he bring in terms of exemplification of the themes? What does he do in terms of driving up the tension of the narrative, as kind of thinking of him as kind of a narrative vehicle, right? And I talked about this with an Inspector Calls and with Of Mice and Men. The characters don't exist. The author does. So what is the author illustrating through the characters? What is the author using these characters as vehicles for? So that is quite a useful thing to think about. If it's a theme, how is this theme exemplified through narrative, character, symbolism, etc. Okay, and again, focusing on the question. But ultimately, the skills for the essay question are similar to the extract for Heroes, and as a result of that, you are you're going to end up making more general statements as well as your specific statements, because with an extract, your more general statements are going to perhaps refer to the extract as a whole, whereas in our essay question, we're going to be referring to the whole text as a whole, and then sort of zooming into that word level analysis as well. So for the extract, I'm just reading the chat. If it asks me, what's my thoughts and feelings as I read the extract, do I make it personal to my opinion? So do you mean, I'm assuming you mean that some past paper questions say, what are your thoughts and feelings as you read the extract? The way that the extract questions tend to be worded now tend to not put personalization in there. They tend to not ask for your opinion. If for some reason it did, you could, but I would be focusing on place the extract and analyze. If you wanted to add in a bit of your opinion, you could maybe add it in as almost a conclusion, but it's not asking you. The question isn't necessarily asking you for your opinion. It's kind of asking. It's asking for it's asking for you. It's kind of giving you that vehicle to then analyze and talk about stuff. For the extract question, if you make a point about one word and then a second point about a different word within the same quote, will you get 1 mark or 2? That's not really how the marking works. Is my mic cutting off? Let me know. I'll talk closer to it. There we go. Let me know if this improves. If it doesn't, then I'll switch out to a different mic. So for the extract question, if you make a point about one word, then a second point about a different word within the same quote, will you get 1 mark or 2? The marking is what we call holistic and qualitative. So what that means is they look at your answer as a whole and they decide on the quality of the whole of your answer, and then they base the mark on that. So it's not as clear cut as something like maths or science, unfortunately, which is annoying, but that's kind of how it is. So if you were to analyze different words within the same quotation, what that does do is that shows perhaps a level of confidence and clarity with the language, and that kind of word level, the regular examples of that word level analysis again show that. What the mark scheme says is at the highest level, learners have the confidence to move from the general to the specific. And what that means is you're able to make comments about the whole extract, or at an essay level, the whole text, but you're also confident enough to talk about individual sounds, individual words, that sort of thing. So we're looking at overall quality, really. So if you picked out a quote and you were only able to talk about one word in it, that's fine. What I would say is try and keep that quote short, if that's the case. Because what you don't want to do is spend 15 of your 20 minutes writing out words that you've memorised of Robert Cormier's, when actually what you're marked on is what you do with that evidence. So I think that's kind of important, really. How many quotes should we know on each character? Again, I'm really sorry. I really wish there was kind of a magic number that I could say. There isn't. What I would say is make sure that, just for yourselves really, make sure that any quotations that you learn are versatile. So that's why I want to kind of talk through themes today, because hopefully you will find that there will be certain quotations that you'll be able to use for a lot of different themes. Or quotations you could use in lots of different essays, and that's kind of a good approach to use, just making sure that you've got those versatile quotes. So there are going to be some really essential ones that you'll know. So for example, Sweet Young Things for Larry LaSalle, that's an essential one. Like you can't really talk about Larry LaSalle without having that quotation there. And that's probably one that you remember. You don't even need to sort of practice revising that one. Or I Have No Face for Francis. and it sort of through doing the essay plans and things, you'll find that there'll be ones that crop up all the time. So it's trying to work smart, not hard, really. In an essay, maybe 10 quotations would be good. But again, I'm saying that you could add far more quotations in there. And it depends on the quotations that you pick and what you do with them, rather than the amount that you write. So I know that's not probably the answer that you wanted. You probably just wanted a number, and I'm really sorry, but that's unfortunately the pain and the joy of English Lit. All right, let's jump into some notes then. So no one said anything about my mic, so let me know if the mic is a problem, because I'm about to jump in some revision notes, so I don't want you to be having to suffer through my voice cutting in and out all the time. I would suggest, if you are thinking about revision strategies, using things like Cornell Notes, using cue cards and active recall quizzing, so getting someone at home or even each other as peers to test each other. Talk for 60 seconds about Larry LaSalle. Talk for 60 seconds about war. Talk for 60 seconds about appearance versus reality. That's a much more efficient way of revising than just writing loads and loads of notes. Oh, great. Thank you. So just, when you're thinking about if there's a particular point you're not very confident with your revision, then think about quizzes. Okay, so we know science says that testing is the most efficient form of revision, self-testing, low stakes testing, where there's no major consequence if you get it wrong. That's how we learn, because learning through forgetting is kind of the weird way that our brain works. So that's a really good way of doing it. And then also, if you're looking for some focused revision clocks are a good shout, because they allow you to chunk up your revision. You can focus it on the topics that you're least confident with. And it means that in an hour, you're going to cover a range of subtopics in a particular subject, rather than sitting for 4 hours, scrolling on your phone for 2.5, and then just copying out notes from a revision guide for the other hour, which is how a lot of people revise. And it does sometimes help, but it's certainly not as efficient as some of these other things. So that's just my little revision PSA there. All right, let's jump into it. So we're going to have a look at some themes. I can talk about some other bits if you want as we go. So again, you sort of add in the chat if there's anything you want me to cover, and I'm just going to zip through these. So the idea is that if you want to come back to these and go through them in a bit more detail, then you can, because you can just come back and pause at the relevant bits. Okay, so heroism and appearance versus reality are two of the major themes that have podcast episodes. So if you've not yet used the podcast, then that again is another resource that you can use to explore these. The podcast episodes are a couple of years old, so you will need to scroll back a little bit through the Of Mice and Men episodes, but there is one there. So heroism. Lots of different angles of heroism. These notes are not fully comprehensive, but there's hopefully some ideas here that you can use. So Francis is seen as a war hero, but the reality is that he doesn't want to be seen as one, and that he doesn't feel that he deserves it. Okay, so the bold bits here are some quotations that might be relevant. And I know that on the revision classroom for my school, we've got some quotes linked to each of the themes as well. So these kind of tie in with that resource as well. So Francis is a really good one to talk about with heroism and the complex nature of heroism. He is seen as a war hero, but as we find out throughout the story, his motivations make that name, that kind of title, quite complex. We can also think of We can also think of Frances as a hero in the context of Nicole and their relationship. She calls him her table tennis champion, and he sees himself as in this romanticized view of their relationship. He sees himself as this great hero when he wins the table tennis match. So you can think about Frances in the context of heroism in that sort of romantic sense as well. Then we've got Larry. Now, he's a hero in very different ways. He's a community hero because he helps out the kids at the rec centre. He turns that community centre into this thriving community hub. He gives the children of Frenchtown something to do. He helps them believe in themselves. He does everything really that a good teacher and a good figure of the community should do. He's also objectively a Silver Star war hero. So he comes back and he gets the Silver Star, and it's one of the similarities between Frances and Larry. And remember, the Silver Star is a medal for real bravery, and is seen as the medal of heroes. But he obviously has a very dark side, and he abuses that trust that not just Nicole but actually all of the children put in him, and therefore he's kind of classed as an anti-hero. So there's lots of mentions of him actually being this war hero, and actually using the word hero to describe him there. But actually, when you look at some of the language and some of the ways that Frances describes Larry, when all of the stuff in the rec centre is going on, you can see that there's this real admiration. They put him on a real pedestal. He is this, they talk about, they're delighted to be in his presence. He's such a sort of superstar hero to them that even just being around him is considered to be an honour. So Larry is, again, a complex character to explore there. Now, I'm guessing that if you were thinking about writing an essay on heroism, you'd probably think about Frances and Larry, but you then perhaps would struggle for the third point. So these are some things that you could write for the third point on heroism. The concept of war and war heroes in general, the fact that they weren't heroes, they were just there. They were scared boys, and the sort of shared trauma of all of the people who went to war and who hang out at the St. Jude's Club. St. Jude, incidentally, is the patron saint of lost causes, I believe. So when we think about symbolism and when we think about deliberate language choices in the play, there's a reason why that club is called the St. Jude's Club. It could have been called anything, couldn't it? But yeah, it's called the St. Jude's Club. So they don't like talking about the war, and it's in the same way that both Frances and Larry add a level of complexity to the idea of what it means to be a hero. It's not clear cut. They're not clear heroes or not heroes. There's aspects of them that can fit into both categories. The war heroes add that complexity too. So again, on the face of it, they are war heroes. There's the cutouts from the newspapers and all of those things. But the reality is that they were terrified when they were there. They did not feel that it was heroic in the way that perhaps the media represented the heroes that go to war. And they suffered the consequences then of the trauma and dealing with the trauma, whether it be physical or mental, when they came back. And there's that idea of the self-perception. They don't see themselves as heroes, and other people, like Mrs. Belander, says poor boy. So there's a level of sympathy. You don't usually feel sorry for a hero. You tend to look up to a hero. So there's that kind of weird understanding that there is this trauma and that heroism comes at a cost when we're thinking about war. We could also talk about Nicole here. So Nicole is very brave after being raped by Larry. If you think about what happened, she was assaulted. Frances heard it happen. And then when you look at the fallout, when you look at afterwards, Frances did not cope well with that whole situation. And Nicole actually dealt with it in a much more strong way than Frances did. So she is a really strong character. She's got clear morals. She's got this emotional strength. And she's got this determination to succeed as well. And crucially, she also has the power to forgive, right? And that's a really, really big thing, because actually it's not this big, flashy, heroic act, but it's one of the bravest things that happens in the story, because she did feel betrayed by him. And it doesn't matter about the fact that, you know, Frances was young and what actually could he have done, you know, because we know that conversation. From her point of view, with her feelings, she felt betrayed by him. But she has worked through that enough to be able to forgive him and to move on. Even though she's been irreparably changed by the event, she's able to move on. And that in itself is this sort of quiet level of heroism and quiet bravery that is it kind of contrasts a little bit with the more flashy Larry LaSalle. And even though Francis isn't flashy, he has the Silver Star, right? He's got that public accolade that shows that he's a hero. Nicole may never wear a medal, but she still can be classed as a hero. Will you post this after? Yes, of course I will. So this will go up. I'll put the link on. It'll be on this channel, but then it will also, I'll post it to relevant Google Classrooms as well. Okay, so these are just, again, a couple of quick notes. So the other one was kind of like, if you were to write an essay, what would you put? But then this covers just some extra notes. So we've got some genuine and some false heroes. And these are the questions really that the book is asking. Is Francis a hero for falling on the grenade? Because he did save people's lives. But is it that the fact that the motivation behind it was selfish, does that mean that it's as heroic or heroic at all? Larry is objectively a war hero, but is also an anti-hero. And he has these destructive qualities. And he says, does that one sin of mine wash away the good things? Or does that one sin of mine wipe away the good things? I can't remember the exact phrasing there, but that quote very much encapsulates this idea of heroism with Larry during that final encounter with Francis. The fact that he feels that because he's got this this really destructive quality, and that he is attracted to young girls, that an attractive quality is one aspect of his personality, but there's lots of good things that he has done. So he's kind of arguing that, well, that's bad, but does that discount all the good that I've done in the community, all the good that I did when I went to war? It's tricky, isn't it? It's not like he's saying, oh, I don't know, I don't like the colour red or something, something that's just not that harmful. What his kind of sin is a particularly harmful and destructive thing. So that kind of question, that kind of conversation is what Cormier is asking us to consider as well. And then war heroes, the ordinary heroes, the real heroes. Arthur Riviere is a great person to talk about here, and we'll talk about him a little bit later as well when it comes to war, because that chapter where he's drunk in the alley is a really short, sharp but powerful demonstration of what war trauma can look like, and how someone who is a war hero is utterly destroyed by the thing that made them a hero. So the nature of heroism ultimately remains unclear. There is no clear hero in the story, and the story is called Heroes, plural, right? So it seems that there are lots of different types of hero in the story, and yet none of them seem to find the happiness or the comfort or the satisfaction that a hero should stereotypically find, right? So is that realistic? Is that pessimistic? And that that's where, when we talked about multiple interpretations, that's where you can ultimately decide what you think, and that's how you're building your argument in your essay. Who's Arthur in Heroes? Arthur Riviere is in, I want to say it's chapter 7. It's either chapter 7 or chapter 8. But he's the one that they find drunk in the alleyway. And he can barely stand upright, and he's just kind of slumped. It's a really short chapter. It's like 2 pages, and he talks about war, and he talks about we weren't heroes, we were only there. Would he come up in the exam? You wouldn't get just an essay question on just Arthur. But you can link him to a lot of themes, and the fact there's only 3 main characters, he's almost like the next, he's like the top secondary character. So Enrico and Arthur are 2 characters that you should have a little bit of an idea about, and we'll talk a little bit more about them as we go through this now. But yeah, they're definitely people who you can link to themes and to expand your essays. You would, if you only talked about Nicole, Larry and Francis, and you didn't think about or mention anything else, there will be some essays that you would struggle with. You would be able to write some essays, but there would be some that you would struggle with. So that's why he's just quite useful to kind of have in your back pocket in case something comes up. And it's kind of showing that more detailed understanding of the book, which leads to better marks as well. Okay, war. Let's talk a little bit about this. So you will find very quickly as we go through this that the themes overlap, very similar to An Inspector Calls. So this is also a major theme: devastating, isolating effects of war. And when we think about war, we're thinking about, in this book, very much the appearance of war versus the reality of war. So we have the appearance, which is what the propaganda shows us, which is what the media shows us. And you can see that they buy into it. There's, Francis talks about this like crusade for glory and things like that. So that kind of glossy storybook style war is definitely sold to them. But then that contrasts with that reality, the terrifying, disgusting, reality of these boys being sent to war and not really knowing what to do, and then finding that the people that they're killing on the other side are just as scared and just as young as them. So there's this public image, there's medals, there's glory, there's praise, and Larry himself fits really well into that. And he's kind of used by the media a little bit, especially when he comes back from the war, but also just before he goes to war. He fits with that veneer, that kind of glossy veneer. But then the reality, those horrific wounds, the fear, the smells, all of that is shared. And Cormier uses a lot of sensory language to show that horror. So it's not just the fact that it looks horrible, it smells horrible, and it sounds horrible. He creates this real kind of sensory picture for us as a reader, so we really understand how awful it is. So, of course, we open the book with some dramatic war injuries, right? So we've had Francis and Enrico. So Enrico loses 3 limbs in the war, and so Enrico is really useful to kind of talk about the physical impact of war alongside Francis. And they're talked about in a very matter-of-fact way. That makes them, if anything, more horrifying, because it's almost like they're numb to it, or that it's been normalised in their heads. But it's so horrific. And Francis has this really naive view of war until he has to face the reality of killing German boys, and they are described as boys, so that youth is kind of shown there. And Francis and Arthur's accounts of war give us the reality. So if you want to talk about war and get those minor characters in, obviously you can talk about Francis and Larry, but Enrico and Arthur are really good. Arthur you can use because he shows the mental impact of war, the mental trauma of war. And then Rico shows the physical trauma of war. You can also bring in Joey LeBlanc. If you remember him, he's one of the characters. He's the one that, when Francis is younger, he seems to be the one who's quite smart. He's got a lot of personality. He seems to be almost like the popular kid. And he's the one that kind of seems to work out what Larry is before Francis finds out, and before anyone else finds out. He seems quite sharp, quite clever. And he doesn't appear when Francis returns to Frenchtown. Now, it's not explicitly stated, but we can assume that Joey died in the war. So we've got these three characters that all show the consequences of war, but in different ways. And Joey's absence from the present shows that it doesn't matter how good looking, how great a personality, how smart you are. It doesn't matter about that. War doesn't discriminate. You'll be killed if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. So they're quite nice characters to bring in for that theme. So we've got this idea of the reality and that sensory depiction, like I said. And the war does also generate respect for those involved in it. So that they are treated really well when they come back. Just in terms of, being in the club and stuff. So that's kind of this lovely little bubble. But the reality is that beyond that, they talk about their prospects, they talk about going to college and doing lots of things, and there's different options available to them. But beyond that, the truth is that they're not actually treated like the heroes that the picture book heroes that people think they are. So they might have options, but they might have also been so badly hurt, either mentally or physically, that the options that they've been given aren't really options to kind of explore. It's great if you can train to be a firefighter, but if you're Enrico and you've had your legs blown off, you can't really, can you? So for some like Enrico, he feels like suicide is the only option for him, because he doesn't feel like he can actually do anything at this point. And that lack of support mentally as well leaves people like Arthur to be vulnerable. Okay, so that's war. Again, these aren't comprehensive notes, but hopefully it's just useful to sort of talk through some of the different aspects that you could pull into an essay. And you can see here that war very closely ties into appearance and reality. So that as a theme is, you could write a whole paragraph, you could write a whole essay on just the appearance and reality of war. But if appearance and reality was the theme that came up, you could write a paragraph on war, nice and easy. Okay. Excuse me. Appearance and reality. This one should be quite a nice quick one to go through, because we've gone through so much of it already, really. So this links to identity. There's a difference between presentation and reality, because nothing is as it seems really in this story. So Larry is a great example of this, and I'm sure that would be the first person you'd think of when you thought about this theme. Francis has his silver star, but of course we know the motivations were actually more selfishly driven. Then we've got that veterans club, Arthur Riviere, and the fact that he seems okay, and then we find him slumped in the alley a couple of chapters later. Enrico Ruccelli, who hangs out with Francis in hospital. He is, he laughs and he jokes and he's quite funny in the bits where we get to see him, but actually he describes him, he sort of talks about death by suicide as sort of taking out the trash. So he really considers himself to be less than human. He considers himself to be like not worth anything, just thinking about himself as trash, really. Then we've got Nicole. She hides the attack from her family in order to spare them pain. which you could consider being brave and heroic, but is also, if we could also argue that the motivation is obviously very pure, but it's an act of deception, it's appearance and reality. And then we've got war, so that there's this one of the central themes of the story is the fact that the appearance and reality of war are very different. And there's that contrast between what the media presents and then the horrific reality. And then we can also link this with the theme of heroism. So we've talked about that already. The fact that heroes are presented in one way, and yet when we kind of dig a little bit deeper, our heroes are not necessarily who they are presented as. So we see that through Francis, we see that through Arthur, we see that through Larry, lots and lots of them. So if we were thinking about writing this as an essay, then you could think about some of these points. So Francis hiding his identity, that's a very sort of literal sense of appearance and reality. He doesn't want to be recognised because his mission is to kill someone, and he's known as a hero, but the reality is that he isn't. Larry appears to be a hero, and this is a great quote for Larry LaSalle as well. Dazzling movie star teeth. This is a great quote because we can pick apart lots of the words here. So the word dazzling, if something dazzles you, it tends to shine so brightly that you can't see properly. And that's what Larry does. He comes in and he shines so brightly that people can't see him for what he really is. And then we can link that to the idea of movie star. So if you think about a movie star, their job usually is to act. They're an actor. And what does an actor do? An actor plays a role. So what's Larry doing? Larry is playing the role of this community hero in order to potentially get close to young girls to be able to prey on them. So that's quite a nice quotation. Again, that one and Sweet Young Things are kind of two really good ones for Larry LaSalle. So Larry's there, and then we've got war as well. So war appears to be exciting and glamorous, but in reality, it's pretty grim. Arthur is the best kind of distinct example to show this. But of course, we've got Francis. He's a really good example. And that opening where he talks about his face is really, really useful as well. Okay, so let's move on to our next theme. Love. Now, I know that a few people have talked about this one, and because it feels like perhaps, quite a challenging one to talk about, or quite a challenging one to build an essay for. So there's different types of love that we could explore. There's the obvious romantic love. We've got Francis and Nicole. We can also explore that kind of transition from more courtly love to romantic love. The fact that Francis puts Nicole on that pedestal and treats her in that way that is reminiscent of courtly love, and then it moves to that more traditional romantic love around the table tennis tournament. And the fact that power dynamic shifts from Nicole being much more powerful, and when I say powerful, I'm just talking about the one that kind of holds the cards in the relationship, and Francis is the one that drives that, right? He puts her right on that pedestal, talks about her being a statue of Saint Therese and all of that. So there's that power dynamic there, and then that shifts so that he's a bit more even with her. I'd still say she still holds the power in the relationship, but he's a bit more even with her around the table tennis tournament then. Then we've got the predatory and forbidden love between Larry and Nicole. Sweet Young Things, We Love Our Sins. And that one, again, things like the dance scene. There's a little bit where Francis is watching Larry and Nicole dance. That's a really good section to look at for the relationship between Larry and Nicole. So I definitely kind of recommend looking at that. It's a really long, it's kind of one really long sentence, and it talks about her slipping down him allowing her to slip down his body and things like that, which is really, again, it uses some sensory language, and it's quite creepy, but it's a really good kind of example of that predatory forbidden love. How love can also be ruined. So Francis and Nicole's broken relationship and that betrayal. And that, so when we think about love, we can talk about kind of the breaking and the absence of it there. And we can also then talk about different type of love again. So I'm sure in RE you will have done different types of love. There's the kind of platonic love, romantic love, and all the different kind of Greek terms for them. And here we've got this idea of the love for comrades and that shared trauma. So the love that the war veterans have for each other. And it's that deep rooted understanding that they've been through something terrible together. And as well as that, you've also got the love of the townsfolk for the veterans, including Francis, although he obviously tries to hide his identity, but kind of the veterans as a whole. And then the more public Larry, when he comes back and says, he gets the key to the city, or the key to the town, sorry, and he's kind of described as our hero. So lots of different kind of types of platonic love in relation to war there as well. Okay. So just before I jump into this one, I'll give 30 seconds just to see if there's any questions so far. I do know that I'm going fast, and I know that there's lots that I'm going through. Like I said, this video will be then put on, it'll be put up so that you'll be able to kind of go back and look at it. But please, if there's any questions that you've got, feel free to ask them. If not, then I will carry on. Okay. If any questions come up as I'm going through, then again, please use the chat as we go. So, suffering. This is again, the thing is with heroes is that there's lots of different ways that themes can be worded. So you will have done things on this even if you've not seen the term suffering in particular. But we've got here the theme of suffering. So there's physical, mental and emotional suffering throughout. And some of that's going to be more obvious than others. So Francis suffers. Obviously, he's got the physical injuries that he's dealing with, and his physical recovery is a challenge as well. Then we've got Francis, and he wants to make Larry suffer as part of his mission. Ultimately, he wants to kill Larry. But he wants to kind of have that conversation, have that catharsis of making him suffer. Nicole suffers, obviously, from Larry attacking her. And, that kind of moment at the end of it's chapter 11, isn't it? That moment where it's kind of described from Francis's perspective, that very much, kind of encapsulates her suffering is really kind of difficult, is a difficult read, because you can really feel and understand her pain and her suffering in that moment. Larry suffers physically and mentally after the war, and this is important because he's seen as this kind of invincible hero, right? It's a bit like and this is aside from him being what he is and being attracted to young girls and things, but the fact that he was such a pillar of that community. I don't know whether you have this thing where, my dad is and will always be kind of like this superhero figure in my life, which means that if I ever see him weak in the sense of like being upset or being hurt, then it feels really strange. It feels like the world is distorted a bit because he's meant to be this invincible superhero. So like that's kind of what happens with Larry, right? Larry's this sort of superhero to these children. And he almost like sort of cartoon invincible superhero. So the fact that he suffers physically and mentally after the war, that's really kind of quite shocking. The fact that, again, in the same way that we talked about Joey LeBlanc, and then someone who's kind of funny like Enrico as well. War doesn't discriminate. It doesn't go, oh, you know what, you're really funny, or you've got a show business career ahead of you, or you've got real promise, we'll leave you alone. It doesn't do that. So the fact that there's no discrimination, and someone like Larry, who seems to be invincible, is hurt, kind of again shows the indiscriminate nature of war. And then Enrico as well, like we said, suffers physically and emotionally. How would you say Robert Cormier presents Francis and Nicole's relationship as a word? See, that's difficult because it changes. I would say it goes from courtly to romantic to broken, right? So courtly to romantic to broken. I would say that at the start as well, it's not unrequited, but Francis is definitely in deeper than Nicole from the start, right? So it's almost unrequited at the start. So it's one-sided at the start. And it starts with this kind of real admiration that turns into romantic love. So if you're not comfortable or confident talking about courtly love, you could just talk about that sort of devotion or admiration. So it starts as this devotional admiration, it turns into romantic love, and then it turns into that broken one. The first word I said, devotion or admiration, when you admire someone. I'd say either devotion or admiration there. But I also said courtly love. So courtly love is that kind of medieval, ritual-driven kind of idea. And I'm guessing you would have probably done that in class. So courtly love, a good example would be where the princess gives, or the lady gives the knight a handkerchief, right? A kind of lace handkerchief that shows a token of her affection. It's very ritual driven and romantic. It's not physical. It's not, it's more about kind of tokens of affection, and it's quite distant. And it's popularized in medieval times. But like I said, if you're not comfortable with that, I'd go with devotion or admiration. Okay. So let's look at suffering a little bit more. So if we're thinking about suffering in the context of different characters, we've got Francis. He suffers physically. He did also suffer as a youngster. We briefly find out about his younger childhood, that he lost his parents, but then he also has that low self-esteem that Larry, kind of helps to build up, and he's got that unrequited love from Nicole when they first meet. And he does suffer because of his lack of action during Nicole's rape. I would argue that Francis is also groomed by Larry, so that he listens to Larry and he doesn't feel like he can ever challenge Larry. And that is arguably deliberate, so that he can get to Nicole without Francis getting in the way. But then there is that suffering because of that lack of action. So Larry also suffers after the war, and has, like we said, the physical and psychological impact there. Enrico shows the extent of suffering. So he's lost an arm and his legs, and he just feels that he needs to end it as soon as he can. The veterans suffer. No one talks about it. So I think that was a little bit of the extract that some of you would have done today, or part of something that you could have explored in the extract. The idea that there's the veterans all kind of nicely talking about their futures and everything's very nice, and it's that elephant in the room. And I'm sure we've all been there, where we're having conversations, and nice, easy conversation with people, but we all know something that we're not talking about. And it's that, right? The veterans are all suffering. They're all having their problems, but no one is actually talking about it. They're just talking about how they're going to be a firefighter or they're going to be a teacher. No one's talking about the fact that they're struggling to sleep at night, or they're having nightmares, or they're drinking themselves to the point where, they can't stand up to deal with the suffering that they're having to go through. And then the obvious one there is Nicole is suffering. She suffers during the assault, but she also suffers afterwards because she had relied on Francis. And she refuses to see him, which means, again, she's isolated. She doesn't have anyone to share that experience with and to help kind of deal with it. So that suffering continues alone in isolation. Okay. Well, I've got a cheeky Inspector Calls one got in there then. Right, guilt and forgiveness. So guilt and forgiveness, again, you'll see there's lots of overlap here, and hopefully you can see that. So Francis, guilt and forgiveness is, again, potentially something you could look at. Religion is also another theme, but guilt and forgiveness and religion can link together quite nicely because this is this text is rooted in Christianity, and guilt and forgiveness is a key part of that, right? So Francis leaves Nicole, he suffers that guilt, and then that mission of revenge against Larry is kind of driven by that guilt. So revenge is something that could come up, but revenge is in this story often driven by that guilt, right? So the driver for that revenge is guilt. What did I say about Larry grooming Francis? So it's more of an opinion than a fact, but I would argue that my reading of the book is that Larry grooms Francis to, as he does with all of the children in the rec centre, to listen to him, to admire him, and to kind of follow his orders almost, so that he's able to get close to Nicole. There's the quote that describes him as the Pied Piper, and the Pied Piper famously, when the townspeople wouldn't pay for him, the Pied Piper getting rid of the rats in their village, the Pied Piper plays a tune and all the children follow him out of the village. So you can see that there's this idea of Larry being able to sort of play a tune or say something and then all the children just follow, right? It's that kind of idea. He's in control all the time, and therefore Francis is in some ways a victim of his, in the same way that lots of the other children in the rec centre may be, and obviously Nicole certainly is as well. So Francis feels guilty about his motives for going to war, and certainly feels guilty afterwards, when people are calling him a hero, and he doesn't want any of that recognition because he really feels like he's not deserving of it. So he can't forgive himself for his actions to Nicole. He does pray for others. If you remember right at the start, he kind of says a prayer for people. And he feels guilty about the fact that he's prayed for Larry because he's going to kill Larry. And Francis is plagued by guilt throughout lots of this book, and it can make him quite miserable throughout lots of it as well. And he's plagued by guilt, not only because of the original thing that he did or didn't do, which was not helping Nicole, but he also then feels guilt because of the way he tried to deal with it by going to war, and the selfish motivation to try to end his life, right? So in contrast to this is quite useful again when you're thinking about themes. You can think about the absence of a theme in a character, because that will be a deliberate choice by the author. And Larry feels no remorse and no guilt. He is just trying to justify his decision. He's trying to justify who he is and what he likes and things. And the contrast between those two characters and the way they deal with the things that they've done is kind of an interesting angle to go to look at for guilt and forgiveness. So there's lots here about guilt, but if we're thinking about forgiveness, we do have to think about Nicole a little bit as well. So here we've got our three main characters and how they link to guilt and forgiveness. So Francis, we've said, so guilty about everything. Larry, in contrast, does not feel any guilt. Larry very much forgives himself because he sees himself as doing good things and just having a bit of a bad habit. Whereas Francis really struggles with the idea of forgiving himself. Then we've got Nicole. So Nicole forgives Francis in the end, and that in itself is a brave thing for her to do. And that is also needed for her to have that closure to move on. So Nicole, really, if you're looking for someone who is the closest thing to kind of a moral hero, so someone who kind of embodies that goodness, that's going to be Nicole, right? So Nicole forgives Francis, but Francis doesn't forgive himself. So she kind of acknowledges by the end that realistically he couldn't have done anything, right? And therefore, what's the point in feeling betrayed and feeling frustrated with him when even if he tried, he couldn't have done anything, right? And she tries to help him forgive himself too, which again is an exceptionally kind of brave, heroic, selfless thing because it happened to her, and yet she's the one kind of helping him get over it. So again, I know I've said this a few times, but these are not comprehensive notes. They're just some ideas that if you were looking to build up a bit of a bank of essay plans, these might help you out. Okay. All right, we're going to, I'm aware that I'm running over time a little bit, but we're going to have a quick chat about the part of the essay that is maybe different to an Inspector Calls. So if you're thinking about just some things that you may want to say or just be aware of when you're planning that you could bring in about narrative or language or devices, then you can do this. Now, you will naturally do this by analysing your quotations. So don't think of it as something extra. It's just maybe while you're thinking about your quotations, these might be things that you could consider, or it might just be another way for you to look at the story while you're revising. So we know that the narrative is non-chronological. It doesn't follow time. It goes from past to present and back again. And what that does is that means that tension is built. And it means that by the time we find out what happens to Nicole, we are invested in these characters. And that's really important for our emotional journey as the reader. So the flashbacks show us the development and motivations of the characters, and we can see how Francis changes between the past and the present. And the flashbacks take place in the first 12 chapters. So then after that, we just follow Francis and him kind of completing his mission. So this suspense, this tension is created because we know from the very start that Francis wants to kill Larry, and yet when we are introduced to Larry, there's this real kind of amazing hero and Francis really seems to look up to him. So that kind of means that we're a bit confused as to what's happened to change that and to make him so keen on destroying Larry. So the narrative is deliberately structured to build that tension, to help us get invested in the characters, and it means that by the time the assault happens, it has the emotional impact that it should have and that it deserves. If we found out about that when it happened chronologically, we wouldn't care as much. Of course we would care, but we're not as invested in these characters, so we don't understand the impact in quite the same way. So let's look next one. what characters do you think might come up in the essay questions for Heroes? For Heroes and an Inspector Calls. So this is really difficult to say this year, if I'm honest. And that's because this is the last year that this exam is running. So whereas before we've been able to kind of bank on knowing the past paper questions and things, this time it's a little bit more challenging. I believe that there's a past paper questions bank that will have been shared on Google Classroom, so that's worth looking at, because the ones that have come up more recently might be slightly less likely to come up. However, I would not be able to say for sure. The inspector's not come up for a while for an Inspector Calls. Eva Smith as well has not come up. However, they are arguably slightly harder to bring context into. They're not really, I don't think, but from an exam board point of view, they might kind of feel that. So Inspector, Eva, for Inspector Calls are just worth looking at, because as well, they're worth looking at because you can bring them into every other essay. So that's why, again, they're quite a good bet to spend some time on. When it comes to Heroes, we think appearance and reality or something along those lines might come up as a theme. Characters for Heroes is tricky. It could be, because it could be just a character, or it could be perhaps a relationship. So it could be like Francis and Nicole. It could be Francis and Larry. They could be really mean and ask about the minor characters, and by the minor characters they don't mean all of them. They would mean people like Arthur, Enrico, and Joey, and those characters ultimately are showing different aspects of war. So what they're asking you to do is write about war there. But yeah, I think Larry came up pretty recently. And so yeah, maybe something like Francis and Nicole. But what I would say is, this year is likely to be even more unpredictable than ever. So I would, especially for Heroes, where there's, we've got 3 main characters. The thing is if you revise themes, if you revise themes, then you're going to end up covering all the characters anyway. So that's why kind of revising themes is quite a useful thing to do, to build up that sense of characters. Inspector. Okay, so really quick tip for the Inspector. Do you know when you looked at Of Mice and Men, you would have talked about Slim? And Slim didn't embody any of the 1930s attitudes. But because of that, he kind of highlighted them. You would have talked about that, right? So with Of Mice and Men, you would have talked about how the fact that Slim doesn't embody any of the 1930s attitudes highlights them in the other characters. Well, the Inspector kind of does the same thing. So he's classless. Or he gives the impression of being classless, but he fights for the working classes. I would talk about the Inspector not conforming to what the Burlings kind of fit in with and social class. I would talk about him being Priestley's mouthpiece. Some people say that he's Priestley's mouthpiece because that's a nice, easy way to get Priestley in there and be able to talk about Priestley's kind of views. And when you think about some of the things that the Inspector says, he's basically talking through the Inspector. And you can also bring up the fact that the way that the Inspector reacts or doesn't react to other characters highlights the fact that he's not conforming to societal expectations. So the fact that he doesn't submit to Mr. Burling's authority, the fact that he doesn't kind of buy into the normal kind of admiration that Mr. Burling would perhaps usually get. Same with Mrs. Burling. Even the fact that, like when we talked about the lighting change, so he goes from that pink, that cozy pink to the bright white. That kind of shows that he's shining that spotlight on the class system at large. So he's shining that spotlight on the Burlings, but in doing that, he's shining it on the middle and upper classes and their exploitation of the working classes. So you're right, like he feels a bit more abstract, doesn't he? He feels a little bit more challenging to talk about when it comes to context. But what I would say is the inspector is almost like the Slim of an Inspector Calls. He doesn't fit the traditional attitudes, but in not fitting, he's highlighting the flaws in those traditional attitudes. I hope that kind of makes sense. So yeah, that would be something to perhaps explore. Okay, let's go back to Heroes briefly. So just talked about narrative structure. Let's talk about language. So Cormier creates these realistic descriptions of people. It's all quite bleak. And yeah, you definitely get that sense of bleakness in the story. And the sensory language that's used to depict some of the very emotive scenes is really, really powerful. So when you're talking about language, it's just useful, if you've got a quote that you think is great, is there anything in there that embodies any of the five senses? Because then you can bring in that sensory language and kind of talk about that. There's kind of clear shifts in mood. So you can see you can see the key chapters there where there's sort of real shifts in mood, and that again is shown by some of the descriptive language. So Cormier does have quite a descriptive language. He's very plain speaking. I think the language in the book is quite straightforward. There's nothing really challenging. There's nothing too challenging to explore there, but the simple language doesn't mean that there's no techniques or conscious structuring or anything. The descriptions really kind of build those pictures for us. He uses, as I just said, short sentences, simple vocabulary. He's talking as Francis, right? And Francis is an aspiring writer, so the writing is engaging, but it's also plain speaking. It's very easy to understand. And what that means is it adds a real starkness to some of the horrific descriptions, because they're not flowery, that he's not kind of using euphemism, he's not hinting at things, he's just saying things how they are. So sometimes his thoughts are recorded as well, so that if again those quotations are relevant for you, then it's just useful to recognize that his thoughts are there, which again reminds us that we've got an unreliable narrator. All narrators are unreliable if they're first person, because they'll always be from the perspective of a particular character. We've got that tension and suspense that's created in the opening, and the simplicity, really at any of the points where war is being talked about, the simplicity of that language can be quite shocking, and that creates that powerful imagery. So he does use similes and metaphors. Remember, simile is a comparison using like or as, and a metaphor is saying that something is something else. So he uses similes and metaphors to kind of build that picture of war. And that literary kind of layer of his language adds that extra sort of sensory power. Okay, no problem. All right. We're nearly at the end now, I promise. If you stuck with me this far, then well done. Especially after if you did a mock this morning, very well done. So irony and foreshadowing. Now, we all know about irony, foreshadowing and dramatic irony from an Inspector Calls, because that play is like dramatic irony 101. But it's also present in Heroes. So irony is about saying one thing and meaning something else in very simple terms. Okay, it is slightly more nuanced than that, but that's ultimately what it is. And the title of the story is ironic, because Cormier is saying that there are heroes, but what exactly is a hero? He's questioning the nature of heroes. He's saying that, people who are called heroes may not actually be heroes, and vice versa, because Nicole is the only one who's not really called a hero, and yet you could argue that she's got some quite heroic traits. Francis sees himself as a coward, because he claims that this heroic deed that he carried out, he did as an act of cowardice. That's irony, right? So that's where something happens and actually there's a different meaning behind it. I suppose that's a way to sort of describe it. It's a strange twist of logic. The irony of the name of the rec centre as well. So we know why it's called the rec centre, because of the whole story about the wedding, but Francis and Nicole's lives are also wrecked because of what happened there. So the irony and the foreshadowing of it being called the rec centre before their lives were wrecked, the fact that is kind of foreshadowing what's to come. And this is where that narrative structure is really important, because words and phrases become ironic in kind of like once we know what's happened. So Larry at one point manipulates a spotlight over Nicole. You wouldn't usually use that word when you're talking about a spotlight. You might say adjusted a spotlight or trained a spotlight over Nicole, but instead he's used the word manipulated. So that tells us again he's manipulating Nicole, right? And he's giving her the attention in order to manipulate her to kind of build that rapport with her. Larry's figure is also described as lethal. Remember, he's like knife-like, lethal. So that could perhaps be foreshadowing his behaviour. So there's lots of clues of foreshadowing. And again, I know I mentioned it before, but that passage where Nicole and Larry are dancing is a fantastic example of foreshadowing. There is so much to pick out of that little passage, that in terms of their relationship, but also the foreshadowing of what will happen, and the fact that at all times he lets her fly. He is in control of her, and she bows down at his feet, so she is kind of buying into this control that he has. So that irony and foreshadowing is there throughout, and these are just some examples. There are, of course, many more in the story as well. And then just a few symbols that might be quite useful. So symbols or motifs, repeated ideas throughout the story. Again, this is just if you want to, if there's something that you're talking about and you want to add an extra layer to your analysis. So Francis's scarf is a symbol that's linked to themes of war, identity, appearance, reality, because he's physically hiding in the same way that he is sort of hiding away from his name as a hero. He's hiding his guilt. He's hiding behind his guilt, and behind his shame, because he finds it hard to come to terms with the fact that he's seen as a hero, because he feels that he's a fake. So he's physically hiding parts of his identity in the same way that that kind of shows the other kind of ways, the larger ways that he's hiding his identity. Then we've got guns, very much symbolic of the burden of guilt. So do you remember just before he meets Larry, he says the gun is like a tumour on my thigh. The fact that it's this extra weight, and tumours can obviously sometimes be cancerous, they can be damaging. So again, we've got this idea of the gun kind of weighing him down and damaging him in the same way that the guilt weighs him down and damages him. But even right at the end in chapter 17, he's still relying on that gun. There is still the possibility that he could die by suicide, but now the weight of the gun is comfortable. So it's not like it's destroying him anymore. So maybe that closure means he's got rid of his guilt, and now this gun is not that damaging weight, it's that comfortable weight. And then finally we've got the table tennis match, which links with themes of appearance and reality and love. So that's Larry's ability to manipulate, which leads to that foreshadowing. And then there's also the idea that there's this underlying battle between Larry and Francis for Nicole's affection, sort of like a love triangle. There's another kind of aspect of symbols, and that's the use of colour. So if we're thinking about Nicole in particular, the colour white is important with her. He talks about her and her pale purity when he first meets her. She's often described as wearing white or liking white clothes. And yet in chapter 11, on the day, at the point she's assaulted, she wears a white blouse and a navy skirt. So it kind of shows that purity, it sort of foreshadows the fact that purity will potentially be compromised or destroyed. And that the colour white is particularly important for Nicole. And, if you were sort of grasping at straws a bit, then you could, I suppose, link Francis's white scarf with, that sort of unspoken connection that he still has with Nicole. That white colour linking to the white of her clothes. But the main thing really there is the fact that she wears white until the day she's assaulted, and then she wears white and navy. Would you say that Nicole knew Larry's true self because of when she says to Francis, "Stay close to me"? I think that there is a sense that Nicole perhaps feels that she's... I don't know whether she definitely knows, but there's certainly a sense that she feels that she may be in danger in the moment. You could argue that perhaps she knows. There isn't a huge amount before that moment that tells us that she knows, but they've potentially spent long enough together that something may have happened before. But yes, I would say certainly in that moment she feels potential danger, or just being uncomfortable, right? And I think that that's fair to say. Even if everything was completely fine, you still would feel relatively uncomfortable in the dark, in a room, kind of, or after hours, I suppose, in a room by yourself with your, dance teacher. That potentially feels a little bit uncomfortable. You kind of just want someone there, like if even if like you stay after class and it's just you and a teacher, like that doesn't, quite often people will stay like with a friend or whatever, just because there's a weird dynamic to kind of have, right? And here he's asking for a dance as well. It's not even like he's having a conversation about dance technique or something where you would naturally have a conversation with your teacher. So the situation's a little bit odd, and maybe because of that her radar's a little bit on edge, and she wants to say, "Stay close to me." But yeah, so in that moment, I would say that she feels that danger. It's, I think maybe like we all have those moments, don't we, where we suddenly feel like, oh, something's not quite right. And I think she's kind of feeling that. Okay, so that's, again, a whirlwind tour. I know it's been a marathon, but that's been a whirlwind tour of some themes for Heroes, hopefully a little bit of like some points that you could make with some essays, and then a little bit of narrative, language, and symbolism at the end there. I'll leave the chat open now just for a couple of minutes, just for if there are any questions. And then if not, then I'll just briefly talk through a couple of other things, and then I will let you go and enjoy the rest of your evening. Anything? Oh, there's a slight delay on the chat, so what I'll do is I'll carry on talking about just the last bit, and then I'll check as we go. Okay, so we've got a couple more sessions going on. I think there's one more now for literature for Unit 2. Yeah, so we've got it in 2 weeks' time. But actually, I'd be quite happy to move it just to next week, if that's better. Just because that not the writing. I don't think I'm doing the writing one. So the one that's kind of in red, the approaches to writing. I don't think I'm doing that one. So we could move that back. So if you want to move it back, or maybe I'll put a poll in the Google Classroom or something, then we can do that. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a study with me. So I'll have a paper. I'll share the paper in advance, and we'll go through the paper and we'll have a go at answering it together. I'm not doing the full 2 hours, but I'll kind of talk through planning, and we'll talk through an extract, and we'll talk through an essay plan basically. So I'm letting you kind of know that in advance, so that if there's any particular essays or extracts you would like me to look at for either In Spectacles or Heroes, then I'll make sure I'll compile a paper of particular topics that people want to cover. Obviously I can't do all of them, but kind of the most popular ones will make it into the paper. And again, we'll do that at 7 p.m. So we can either do that next Wednesday or the Wednesday after. We'll see what people see. And then the other thing is that as I've said before, we have a podcast. So I know some of you have been using it. We've actually had 1,500 listens this month. So I'm guessing that some of you are listening to it, because we've kind of gone a little bit more popular over the last few weeks. But there is a podcast. The QR code is on the screen now. You've got episodes here for an In Spectacles. There's loads of episodes for an In Spectacles. There's a really long episode on context. There's an episode on each of the characters, an episode on lots of different themes, including some really abstract minor themes. So there's loads there on an In Spectacles. There's a few on Heroes. I think there's about 6 on Heroes, so one for each of the major characters, and then 2 or 3 of the major themes. So I know that Heroes and Appearance and Reality are both covered there as well. And then of course I will be putting this video online too. But if you're just looking for something that is on the go and that isn't in video format, then the podcast might be quite useful for you as well. We could look at Gerald for sure. Yeah, I'll definitely write that down as a suggestion. And remember, there's so there's a podcast episode on Gerald up for that as well. And what we got there, how can I access your Google Classroom? So if you're part of my school, then there's a shared Google Classroom that you will be able to access across all of year 10. If you are not part of my school, then I'm afraid you can't access the Google Classroom, sorry. But if you want to make any suggestions, then you can just comment on this video and I'll check it. And I can always then add your topics on that basis. That's absolutely fine. Can I have some quotes that would be good for Gerald? Yes, off the top of my head right now, probably not. But if you think about Gerald highlighting 1912 aspects of society, I'd be looking at the conversation that he has with Burling at the start in Act 1. I would be looking at his reaction to the inspector interrogating him and the fact that he just wants to bring the inspector down, because again that's showing the superiority or the perceived superiority of the upper classes. I would be looking at the his kind of perception of himself when it comes to Eva Smith or Daisy Renton, and how he sees himself as a bit of a Sheila says he's a bit of a fairy prince. So I'd be looking at maybe some of those key moments. Also the fact that he takes charge when they're looking to debunk the inspector. He's the one that rings the infirmary, I think. He either rings the infirmary or the police station or both, but he's definitely kind of taking charge of that situation. So he's looking to get rid of the inspector rather than look at his own guilt. So that's where I would start off by looking. If you're looking at quotes for Gerald, sort of specific quotes for Gerald, then there may be there might be a resource that we can pop on Classroom for you. I will have to double check. But I'd also recommend looking at the podcast, because there are a couple mentioned in there, and they also direct you to points in the play where you can pick out some quotations as well. Okay, any final questions? No? Cool. All right. Well, we've been here for an hour and 40 minutes, so I think it's time that you all had a bit of a rest. Well done if you took part in the mock today. Remember that it is simply designed for you to get used to timings and how the exam feels, so please don't worry about it. It is not a high stakes thing at all. You'll be getting some feedback as soon as we have a chance to mark them. And then you'll have some next steps, some final next steps ready for the exam, which would be great. Thank you very much for joining me tonight. We'll do a paper walkthrough, like I said, either next week or the week after, depending on how people feel. So I'll be putting that together over the coming days. And I hope you have a good evening and relax. And I will see you in the next one. Feel free to comment on this video after we finish and when it goes up, because I'll check the comments regularly to see if there's anything that people want to cover in future videos or anything like that. Okay, diolch, and I'll see you around either in school or on another video again. All right, thank you everyone.